Hello everyone. We're starting off tonight with something a little more appropriate. The squalid, gas-lit world of Victorian London. A city of soul-crushing poverty, industrial wonders and lofty ambition. This was not the London of Queen Victoria's palace garden parties or Sherlock Holmes. It took a little miracle to survive the day in this London of fog, grime and stench. Please take a moment to like and subscribe to the video before you settle in, but only if you truly like my work here. Additionally, tell me in the comments what time it is for you and where you are tuning in from. Seeing who is joining us from around the globe is always exciting. Let's ease into tonight's voyage together by turning down the lights and possibly turning on a fan to provide a gentle background hum. Your brother's foot inches from your face, dirty and twitching a little from some terrible dream, is the first thing you notice as you open your eyes. Greetings from your one and only space. It is the room, not a living room or a bedroom. It's everything too. You live there with 6 other people, a bed, 2 chairs that aren't very sturdy, and a rat that has been there for so long that you're thinking of charging him rent. Patches of wall where something used to be are all that's left of the wallpaper. When it rains, the ceiling leaks, and even when it doesn't, something drips that you haven't bothered to look into. The air is wet, and the fireplace is false. The floor creaks as if to alert you to your own impending death. The thin wool blanket you're covered in hasn't been cleaned since the Crimean War, and the straw cushion beneath your head may have been laced with a long-forgotten sock. Plumbing is not present. The pail in the corner, depending on the time of day and degree of urgency, that includes the bathroom, toilet and emergency water supply. In the mornings, you've learnt to breathe via your mouth. It is beneficial, a little. There is only one window, if that's what you call it, covered in so much fog and soot that it mainly only allows the sound of cartwheels, sellers yelling, and an intense cough coming from 3 doors below. You make an effort to ignore the fact that the window faces an alley where your neighbour keeps his goat and the butcher discards his leftovers. There is a family-wide shuffle every morning. You cover yourself with blankets to stay warm. Someone always knocks over the chamber pot, and you switch places around the wash basin like it's a less fun version of musical chairs. Nevertheless, this space is still home in some way. Just before your neighbour complains about his stolen boots, you can tell which window pane shakes, which floorboard creaks, and which corner drips. You are familiar with the dust, the stench, and the odd feeling of inclusion. Do not be misled, though. This is not a comfy room. It's not adorable. It's a location that makes you suffer a little before you even leave, preparing you for the day outside. The streets won't be much friendlier, I assure you. With half a slice of bread in your hand and your eyes still blinking from sleep, you stagger out the front door and plunge headlong into a wall of stifling fog. However, the beautiful, candlelit haze they describe in literature is not this, no. This is the notorious pea super in London. Additionally, it feels like breathing through a stuffy, frigid sock. The sky is grey, the street is grey, the air is grey, the end of your own arm is hidden from view, and you're fairly certain that the lamppost up ahead is there. Or a horse, perhaps. It could go either way. There's more to this fog than weather. It's deadly. It clings to everything, created by the blissful union of natural mist and industrial coal smoke. It coats your neck, seeps into your lungs, and gives your garments that distinctive London appearance, soot-streaked and slightly combustible. You cough. Everybody coughs, like clattering horses and church bells. It's a part of the local soundscape. Like lifelong smokers, children hack. Old men cough so violently that windows tremble. Additionally, doctors advise relocating to a rural area, which, assuming you own your own property and lungs, is excellent advice. It has a complex blend of scents: horse manure, sewage fumes, chimney soot, and the overcooked cabbage from the previous evening. This would be marketed as eau d'urban misery if it were put into bottles. And it affects everything: your hair, your bread. You wear your one decent shirt to job interviews and funerals. The smell of progress taints everything. The worst thing, nobody is shocked. People literally go about their daily lives without thinking. Even after burning all day, street lamps continue to be ineffective. One person swears as their umbrella vanishes into the mist like a phantom ship, and you hear someone else trip in the alley beside you. It becomes considerably thicker at night. Through door crevices the fog curls. The tenements are covered by it. Additionally, you run the risk of walking directly into the fireplace if you don't have a candle lit. Or worse, the lap of your neighbour. Thus, it is true that the air in Victorian London does not simply suffocate one. It gives you a brand. Smokes you. It challenges you to continue breathing. Furthermore, you haven't yet arrived at the street market. You've escaped your smoke-stained hovel, gotten out of bed, and descended into the grey morning hours. Your stomach rumbles now. It's breakfast time. With decreased expectations, breakfast in Victorian London is more of a ritual than a meal. Breakfast isn't eggs, toast, or a big pile of bacon if you're a working-class person, which you most likely are. It's a bread crust that might be used as roofing material. If the rats in the pantry hadn't devoured the oats, perhaps some porridge, as well as tea always. It is boiled, not because it is comfortable. Furthermore, you probably won't die from anything that has been boiled. Milk. Only if you have the money, and even then it's risky. It could be diluted or worse. Kept with formaldehyde by opportunistic suppliers who believe that the term child-safe is a loose one. Sugar costs a lot of money. Butter. A myth. Jam. Only if your aunt passed away and left you a portion of her estate. You might smell warm bread in the air if you're fortunate enough to live close to a bakery or work in a factory. Avoid becoming overly enthused. You don't have bread like that. That breakfast belongs to someone else, most likely a man whose door has a last name and a hat. You may also find yourself waiting in line at a workhouse for a ladle of greyish gruel if you're a widow, an orphan, or someone who lost their job to a machine. It's warm. You can eat it. The kindest thing one can say is that. Be cautious while purchasing fried potatoes or outdated pork pies from street vendors. The oil is ancient, the meat is unknown, and the likelihood of intestinal regret is great. The smell is strangely alluring, though. Hope permeates everything when you're starved. Wrapped in your coat like a cloak of denial, you eat rapidly while standing. Soft morning music and a dining room are absent. Only fog, cold, and clashing wheels, and the sound of someone shouting about stolen coal in the distance. And now spirits are completely low and bellies are just half full. Now is the moment to enter the actual monster. London's streets. Greetings from Victorian London streets. A vast, disorderly creature, throbbing with dirt, smoke, and suffering. You take calculated risks with every action you do. Additionally, the street doesn't give a damn if you're late for work or are merely attempting to cross the street without getting crushed. The absence of sidewalks is the first thing to notice. If there are, they are so packed, small and cracked that using them is only a courteous suggestion and not a guarantee of safety. Ankle-deep sludge, wagon wheels and hoofbeats make up the muddy battlefield that is the main route. Carts pulled by horses whiz by at scary speeds. Corners are clipped by carriages. You could end up face down in a puddle that smells like something died in it after one bad move, since something most likely did. Be mindful of the gutters now. Carrying all the abandoned glory of the city, they dash down the centre of the street. Coal ash, rotting vegetables, dead rats, chamber pot contents thrown out of windows upstairs, and the odd shoe, foot optional. It takes Olympic-level balance to cross them without slipping, or a very long staff and no dignity. However, the terrain is not the only thing that is working against you. It also affects the individuals. Street urchins are running around like coffee-drinking squirrels, pickpockets are inadvertently touching your coat, and merchants are shouting about eels, kippers, or something vaguely related to meat. Everyone is shouting, always, almost anything. Additionally, there are the coppers who ignore the majority of what goes on around them in an attempt to appear significant. Assuming the shift hasn't finished, or they haven't been bought off to turn a blind eye, if someone is stabbed, they will eventually come over. The smog-filled air was now flavoured with pipe smoke and horse excrement. The bells of St. Paul's can be heard in the distance. However, it could just be your ears ringing from someone shouting in your face about chimney soot. Oh, and the streets become rivers of dirt if it rains, which it frequently does. No umbrella is offered. Nobody even appears shocked. You simply tighten your coat and plod through it, praying that your boots don't melt. This is only your commute, too. If you can make it through the streets, you might be able to locate employment, or at least a job that pays enough to keep mice off your toes and bread on the table. After avoiding hooligans and horses, navigating sewers that pass for streets, and assuming the city permits it, it's time to earn a living. A job in Victorian London was not a title. It's an endurance test, a method of gradually collapsing while holding on to the appearance of stability. You might be fortunate enough to get a job in a factory if you're a man. For pay that wouldn't sustain a well-behaved cat, they work 12 to 16 hours a day, 6 days a week. The sound is overwhelming. Soot, metal shavings, and regret fill the air. Don't worry if you lose a finger in the machine. 20 kids are waiting in line behind you to take your place. Don't be a fan of machines. Try working on the docks where your back gives out at 30 and your teeth fall out at 40. Or try hauling coal or laying bricks if you're that long-lived. Ladies, for pennies, you're cleaning floors, doing laundry for others till your hands are mushy, and sewing buttons until you lose sight of sunshine. And there's always the street if those alternatives are exhausted. No safety, no compassion, no sick leave. Perhaps you work as a mudlark or chimney sweeper, searching the Thames at low tide for bones, nails, or remnants of rope to sell. It has no cost. The dysentery featured as well. Or maybe you've found yourself in a workhouse, that enchanted establishment where the poor are assisted by being forced to work themselves to the bone in return for food that is so tasteless that it almost feels like a punishment. You aren't here to prosper. To avoid dying too loudly is why you are here. Jobs change, illness doesn't. Starvation is the result of injury. There is no HR department, no health insurance, and no workers' compensation. Just a foreman shouting at you to stop bleeding on the equipment, breathe more quietly, and lift more quickly. God forbid you voice any complaints. Behind you, there's always someone more desperate who's prepared to put in even less effort. There is a lack of sympathy and intense competition. So, you do have a job. Don't get overly thrilled, though. A job does not lift one out of poverty in Victorian London. Simply put, it provides you with something to do while you're there. Childhood is hardly a period of innocence in Victorian London. There is a brief window of opportunity before your lungs fill with soot and your back fails. Congratulations. You're deemed employable if you're small enough to fit inside a chimney. Forget about bedtime stories and toys. You're working by the time you're 5 years old. 6 if you have forgiving parents. Attending school is a luxury. Your work is both your present and your future. As a chimney sweeper, you may have to squeeze through small flues and scrape out soot while hoping to avoid becoming stuck. They will stab you with a stick if you scream. They'll assume the worst and continue if you stop moving. Or maybe you're a match girl, dipping wooden sticks into white phosphorus, which poisons your jawbone, causing it to glow in the dark and eventually fall off. The salary, a couple of pennies. The risk, death of bones, a sweet compromise. At low tide, some kids are mudlarks, scrounging through the Thames's poisonous muck. I'm looking for anything that can be sold, like rope or nails. You come out wet and cold and probably infected with something Victorian. Science hasn't even determined what it is yet. Others post ads for pennies, shout about roasted chestnuts they can't afford, or hawk newspapers on the street. You hurry quickly, avoid traffic, and pray that you won't be beaten or run over by a horse today for staring at the wrong man. Work in a factory? The dream is that. Inside. Steady hours. Ignore the amputations, please. Youngsters frequently clean beneath spinning devices that are still operating. You either pick things up quickly or lose a hand. No vacation days, no safety equipment, and no compassion. Only perspiration, commotion, and an adult's constant barking commands. Moreover, are you an orphan? You owe nothing to the world, the street, workhouses, or worse. Others go lost in the mists, a footnote in someone else's tale, while others are sold into service. Victorian industry saw children as inexpensive, submissive, and expendable. Childhood is just never given. It is never stolen. Nevertheless, they manage to survive. They laugh, sing in alleys, and play with scraps in between coughs and shifts, since they must, because even youngsters in London are supposed to bear the burden of empire on their small, soot-streaked shoulders. Try surviving Victorian London as a woman if you thought it was difficult as a guy. You have a job, always. And no, you don't receive awards or applause. You end up with calluses, fatigue, and a society that wants you to smile even when your back hurts. You may work as a domestic servant if you are single. That means carting buckets of coal, blacking the fireplace, ironing till your arms hurt, cleaning floors from sunrise to sunset, and never sitting down unless instructed to do so. You sleep in the attic, you eat last, and it seems that you should be appreciative if the master gets involved. Are you married? It's not much better, it's double. You manage the entire household budget with 3 shillings and a prayer, cook with nothing, sew everything, raise children, usually several, and clean your own house, which is probably just one dirty room. In order to purchase bread, you might then take in laundry from wealthier homes, boiling, cleaning, wringing, and repeating. Some women choose careers as seamstresses, spending 14 hours a day sewing shirts in dimly lit nooks. It pays very little. It damages your vision. Additionally, you lose your employment if your fingers bleed on the fabric. The match factories are another place where white phosphorus practically eats away at your jaw. You have a toothache at the beginning and a rotting face at the end. The management blames you for chewing gum. The street becomes your only choice if none of it pays enough, or if you're widowed, orphaned, or simply unlucky. Sex work is socially disapproved of, legal, and informally disregarded. You could earn enough money for rent and food, or you could be attacked, arrested, or worse. Defense? Only if you include luck and wool gloves. In Victorian London, women were supposed to be submissive, tidy, quiet, and always occupied. Even if the house has no flooring, no heat, and no future, you are its moral centre. There is no safety net, no maternity leave, and no rights. Just other women attempting to survive the same horror, occasionally nice, occasionally vicious. However, they do in some way, with backs bowed from generations of unpaid labour, whispered jokes, and grim determination. Even so, parents make time to sweep the doorstep and console their kids because someone has to do it. You may have escaped the horses, made it through the smoke, and even found employment. But illness is unavoidable in Victorian London. It is present everywhere. In the air, in the walls, in the water, and maybe even in the pork pie you had for lunch. Illness doesn't come calling. It sleeps next to you in your tenement, sits next to you on the tram, and infiltrates your lungs as you stand in line for bread. Let's begin with the fundamentals. They called it consumption or tuberculosis. because it gradually eats away at your body, your lungs, and your will to life. The cough is persistent, deep, and bloody. Everyone is aware of someone who possesses it. Most folks simply continue to work until they pass out. Then there's cholera, which comes as a particularly nasty surprise and enters through your drinking water. You're feeling great one minute, then you're throwing up, thirsty, and frantically trying to avoid becoming soiled in public. It spreads quickly, the streets get quiet. It's too late to chain up the local pump. The harm is done by then. Diphtheria, scarlet fever, typhoid, or frequent guests. Although they all have unique personalities, they all have one thing in common. The poor are most affected. Herbal medicines, homemade poultices, or the enchanted healing qualities of hope are your only options if you cannot afford a doctor. Of course, there's always laudanum, a popular over-the-counter opium and alcohol concoction. Do you have a fever? Consider laudanum. Do you have cramps? Laudanum. Are you mourning the loss of your 8th child? Take 2 doses. You will still pass away, but in a very calm manner. What about the medical professionals? They mean well, though, occasionally. However, Latin is still a guess in medicine. The use of leeches is still popular. Gloves are not worn during surgery. Lister is fascinated by antiseptics. With a street barber, your chances aren't much worse. Illness has no preference. However, your living situation makes it pick you more quickly. Lack of hygiene, no airflow, a room with 10 people. It's the ideal environment for mold, unhappiness, and bacteria to grow. If something doesn't kill you quickly in Victorian London, it will kill you gradually. And if you're still standing somehow, it's time to get more water. Your clothing is stained with soot, and you're perspiring through it. Your throat feels like coal dust has sandpapered it, and your lips are parched. Do you want a drink? Yes. Water, however, is not your friend in Victorian London. The handgun has a porcelain handle and is loaded. The Thames will be our first topic, the city's lifeblood. It's the toilet too, the industrial landfill, the cemetery for animals. Additionally, the city's primary source of drinking water, just for good measure. Imagine a stew of human excrement, dead pets, chemical runoff and rotting veggies, and fish that have gone bad, rushing straight ahead of Westminster. Now raise a glass and toast. Do not be concerned. According to the water business, it is filtered. This indicates that it has gone through a maze of gravel, hope, and perhaps an old boot. If you live in a working-class neighborhood, you may share your tap with 200 neighbors and 3 neighboring factories from a public pump down the block. What's the worst? You may not even be aware of its lethality until the last minute. Bad water is ideal for cholera. Typhoid also does. Like little sharks, they easily move through the pipes. Within days, entire families are removed. A mishandled chamber pot, a shared bucket, a splash from the incorrect pump, and, if you're lucky, your headline material. Taking a bath. That's very cute. The majority of individuals lack bathtubs. You might share one with your family once a week if you're middle class. It's a tin tub in the kitchen once a month if you're impoverished. If so, additionally, you may use that same water to soak your sore feet, rinse your clothes, or make dishwater. Hygiene is imaginative. After the Great Stink of 1858, when the Thames stench was so bad that Parliament abandoned the building, the government finally begins to install sewers. Change came only through smell. When you can, boil your water until then, or sip beer. The Victorian beverage that is safe for both adults and children. Warm, weak, and a little effervescent, with redemption. Yes then, a drink of water can kill you in Victorian London. Avoiding thirst isn't the only trick. It's staying away from where your thirst leads you. You made an honest effort. It's nasty, lengthy, and pays just enough to buy bread from yesterday. The factory will undoubtedly kill you, the water may kill you, and the rent collector does not accept IOUs. What's left then? Crime. And it's more than just an act in Victorian London, it's a professional route. Begin modestly. You might be a pickpocket, or as they say, a dipper. You disappear with a coin bag or pocket watch, blend into the people around the markets and softly bump into someone. Oliver Twist was made famous by Charles Dickens, but the real-life adaptations lacked musical numbers. They were either sent to Australia or condemned to Newgate Prison. Women may become fences, purchasing and reselling stolen things in back alleys while hiding under shawls and deceit. Or perhaps you own a twilight house where thieves leave their treasure before the police arrive. Are you feeling brave? Sell broken fruit or watered-down milk from a rickety cart and become a costermonger scammer before complaints are received. Alternatively, try your hand at card tricks, fraud, or the ever-popular three-card Monte, a fast-talking con with a quicker escape. And if you're truly brave, burglaries happen all the time. If you're desperate, break into a church, a merchant store, or a warehouse. You may discover something useful. Additionally, you may come across a constable who has no bedtime and a billy club. There is a police force, but it is understaffed, underpaid, and frequently lags behind. Additionally, if you understand the system, you can bribe the appropriate official. And you probably do, let's face it. London's crime syndicates were remarkably well organized. Some have entire recruitment pipelines, code words, and areas. Next are the resurrection men who steal bodies from new graves and sell them to medical schools. It's gory, it's against the law, it's more lucrative than button stitching. The implications are real, of course. You risk being jailed, branded, flogged, or worse if you are caught. Taken to a prison colony. However, there is a certain allure to taking a chance if the alternative is to starve on a chilly street. Because starvation is more important than morality in Victorian London, work and crime are not mutually exclusive. It's a job. It's also the only job that hires for a lot of people. Suppose you've managed to catch anything, a cough, a fever, perhaps a delivery cart has run over your leg. It's time to visit the doctor. I wish you luck. Because medicine in Victorian London involved more inventive improvisation with sharp metal and less healing science. Yes, there are doctors out there. Even coats are worn by some. A doctor isn't your first choice, though, unless you're really rich. It's a chemist, where a tiny bottle of laudanum is the remedy for all ailments. Liquid opium, perfect for anything from existential dread to a sore throat. It won't make you better, but you won't give a damn. Not able to pay a chemist? There might be a barber surgeon nearby. Yes, a man who amputates legs and chops hair. He will cut off your wound if it is infected. No anesthesia, no antiseptic, just a pail to scream into and a stick to gnaw into. Don't even consider hospitals. They smell like old bandages and hopelessness, are overcrowded, and have inadequate ventilation. There is no sterilization on the instruments. Between patients, surgeons use aprons to wipe their hands. Despite the germ theory, many people still believe that moral failings and contaminated air are the causes of sickness. Infection could do the job if you make it through the treatment. Splinters have the potential to be fatal. A toothache? Sepsis is 2 days away. And giving birth? Women enter in agony and emerge with a gravestone or a baby, sometimes both. Medical textbooks are full with assumptions and overconfidence. To activate the humours, you may be prescribed mustard plasters, bleeding, or a moderate electrocution. They do this by depleting the body primarily of blood, money, and hope. There are some forward-thinking physicians, hand-washing, cleanliness, and possibly antiseptics. However, their peers typically make fun of them. How can anyone, after all, suggest that a male doctor's hands are contaminated? When ill, what do most individuals do? They bide their time. They drink tea made with herbs. They lie motionless while lighting a candle, because healing frequently feels more incidental than planned, and because every treatment has some risk. To get better, you don't visit the doctor. You leave because you have no other choice. And occasionally, just occasionally, you survive. The fog grows thicker like a cloak as the sun sets, and the gas lamps flicker to life. You may believe that the city is quieter at night. However, this is London in the Victorian era. The true threats emerge when the light goes out. Forget peaceful evenings and cosy homes. The streets are not deserted. They belong to the darkness. The mist is hardly broken by the gaslight. It's all a silhouette, a stooped person in the alley, a silhouette in a cloak behind a lamp-post. One beat too many echoes from footsteps. You're either lost or have run out of better options if you're out by yourself. In an attempt to appear scary, the cops patrol in pairs while brandishing their truncheons. Even the constables, however, are aware that some alleys should be avoided. The majority of criminals wear shoes softer than a copper's boots, and they rule the night. Pickpockets, thieves and robbers flourish after dark. Additionally, you hold your breath and move more quickly if your path passes through Limehouse or Whitechapel. It's not because of ghosts, even if the fog can fool you, but rather because someone might be looking, and he might have a knife in 1888. The danger increases threefold if you are a woman. From corners, men sneer. Whispered offers are made, others come after. Some people don't bother to whisper. Everything is hidden by the darkness, screams, faces, and occasionally bodies. You're not always safe, even if you stay inside. Tenement structures groan and creak. Behind walls, rats scratch. 2 levels below, arguments break out and finish with broken glass or bones. Nobody ever questions why someone disappears, not to mention the fires. Stoves tip, chimneys spark, and a sleeping pad is ignited by an overturned oil lamp. No fire department that comes in a matter of minutes, no smoke alarms. Just neighbors yelling and hurling buckets into an uncontrollable fire. If you have to go outside, you bring a lantern or candle and hope the wind doesn't extinguish the flame. Or worse, attract notice. Because night means peril rather than repose in Victorian London. Poor people don't get a good night's sleep. With one eye open and one ear tuned to the creak of stairs, they sleep soundly. Additionally, mornings are merely a means of survival for many. At least you think it does. Morning comes because light is more often hinted at through the dense, oppressive pollution in Victorian London than it is actually seen. Coal smoke, fog, chimney ash, and the exhausted groans of 1,000 overworked boilers combine to create the grey, oily mist that drifts in like a living creature. Like a squatter who won't go, it creeps into crevices, wraps itself around structures, and settles in your lungs. Once more, you cough, although you never truly stopped. Smog sticks to your skin, irritates your throat, and makes your eyelashes feel sticky. Along with the clip-clop of hooves, the sound of church bells, and someone shouting about turnips, everyone coughs. It's a part of the everyday soundtrack. The cloth comes away black when you wipe the windows. The water turns grey as you wash your hands. No matter how often you wash your clothes, there will always be a slight odour of smoke and hopelessness. Your curtains are soot-stained as well. Like they've seen too much, they hang rigid and heavy. You consider opening the window, but then you recall the outside view. More dirt, smoke, and the stench of a dozen chimney fires vying for control. The worst of it? This is typical. People squint to read, toddlers grow pale, plants on windowsills die of asphyxiation, Londoners live in a perpetual twilight, the sun is a rumour, and drying laundry outside is not even considered unless you like wearing shirts stained with soot and slightly tinged with arsenic. The air gets so thick during the notorious Great Smogs that it becomes impossible to see your own feet. Boats collide on the Thames, omnibuses crash, and people become lost on their way home. One fog killed approximately 270 people in 1873 and lasted for 5 days in a row. The city was hardly aware. Naturally, it's worse for the poor. Cheap, dirty coal fuels their fires. They have thin walls, they have weakened lungs. Like aging dogs, children wheeze through the winter. You are a miracle if you make it to adulthood free of bronchitis, consumption, or enigmatic blackened phlegm. And yet you continue, you light the stove, you go outside, you act as though you can't taste the air. Because the pollution never stops in Victorian London, it simply awaits your arrival. One could reasonably assume that Victorian London was a place of grime, disease, and yelling. You'd be right, for the most part. Yet, something human still flickers in the darkest nooks and crannies, weighed down by poverty and mist, because, strangely enough, kindness also endures here. Even so, you frequently need to squint to see it. When one family runs out of bread before payday, you could see it in the silently handed loaf of bread between neighbours, or in the woman who gives a youngster with bloody feet who is barefoot her last halfpenny. There is no compensation, only a rare and valuable nod and sometimes a smile. People watch out for one another even in the most desolate areas, such as the workhouses, alleys and tenements. Not always, not flawlessly, but frequently enough to demonstrate that the city hasn't entirely violated them. On a cold night, a mother offers her hot brick. On a fresh boy's first ascent, a chimney sweeper keeps him from becoming stuck. Someone who is still strong enough to work receives a dying man's boots. They're not big gestures, they are quiet and little, but in a place where hope is a scarce commodity, they are more valuable than gold. The pubs also have a role. They are overcrowded, noisy, odorous and vital. People congregate there to sing, joke and drink away their sorrows and bruises. You can laugh together over watery ale even if you can't afford meat. A sort of patchwork comfort is created by the street entertainers, penny dreadful vendors and blind street vendors who serve as reminders that not everything in the city is trying to harm you. Here, kindness is not naive, it's useful. It is the result of collective pain. Because your only safety net is one another when the system forgets you, and the wealthy act as though you don't exist. Therefore, people continue to love, get married, have children, and have hope in spite of everything. The filth, the sickness, the fog. Because perhaps the city hasn't triumphed if you can discover a half-hummed ballad, a crust of bread, a kind hand in the cold, or kindness in the gutter. Not quite yet. Would you honestly ask yourself if you would survive Victorian London after 14 chapters of stifling fog, rats in the walls, poisonous water, and toothless chemists recommending morphine for a broken leg? Most likely not. Let's be clear, this was not a comfortable city. Coal, sweat, and the crushed backbones of the working poor were its foundations. It was a daily struggle against sickness, against starvation, against constables, against factory foremen, against landlords, and against the ever-present nagging feeling that you've been forgotten. There were no light switches, soap, antibiotics, or other modern conveniences. There were no days off, no universal health care, and no social safety nets. It was just another foggy morning with a straightforward objective. Don't pass away before dinner. Toilets, toothpaste, and non-toxic tap water are among the things you might miss. When you ask about vegetables or clean your teeth, you might wonder why everyone looks at you. Showers would be missed. You would really miss taking showers. People did, however, survive in some way. They persevered. They had no other option, not because they were superhuman. They established unions. They brought up families. They penned novels, organized strikes, performed music on street corners, and held on to optimism as if it were the last thing left in the cupboard. Yes, they did chuckle despite the fog. They danced in pubs after 16-hour shifts, sung lullabies over yelling kids, and found love in congested slums. They were more than merely victims. They were resilient, tough, and incredibly human. It's not an insult to say that you probably wouldn't last a day. It serves as a reminder, the individuals who did. Almost often forgotten, frequently barefoot and frequently hungry, they bore the burden of an empire. In heated chambers with potable water, they created the world we now gripe about. We might not be able to make it, but at least we should remember them. Not as statistics covered in soot, but as individuals who, day in and day out, managed to survive the unimaginable. Gorgo was born into a city that changed the rules rather than merely breaking them. In contrast to the rest of Greece, Sparta was not renowned for its intellectual discussions or golden temples. It had a reputation for warriors, Gorgo too. At the very top of that vicious food chain, she was born, the daughter of one of Sparta's two reigning rulers, King Cleomenes the Thascian. Gorgo's life was political from the minute she breathed her first breath. In order to form alliances, she wasn't a mere adornment. Other Greeks were startled to learn that women could own land, speak in public, and receive an education in Sparta. Gorgo wasn't your average Spartan woman either. In a society ruled by hoplite shields and sharp spears, she was supposed to watch, learn, and eventually wield influence as the king's only child. She probably grew up watching royal councils when issues of diplomacy and war were discussed with frank urgency. She also listened. Cleomenes, her father, wasn't the most reliable leader. In fact, near the end, some people believed he was insane. However, he left Gorgo with a keen awareness of the true nature of the knife edge of power and the potential dangers of politics. There is a well-known tale. A foreign ambassador attempted to buy off her father to back the Persian Empire when she was just 8 or 9 years old. Young Gorgo came up and bravely warned her father while the adults muttered, "You'd better get out, father, or this stranger will corrupt you." It was more than merely precocious. It had no fear. The man was expelled from Sparta when her father listened. The lesson people learned early on not to underestimate Gorgo's teeth. Gorgo was displaying political intelligence and sharp judgment before she was even of marriageable age. She was more than just a biological relative. She behaved like royalty. And Gorgo flourished in a culture that valued order, precision, and uncompromising honesty. Her fate had already been set in motion. She was a Spartan lioness, ready to defend her people and, if necessary, speak louder than the kings themselves, rather than a submissive queen in a glittering palace. Gorgo's union with King Leonidas was not a story of lavish weddings or courtly passion. Weakness was hated and realism was the norm in Sparta. Leonidas was no ordinary Spartan. Known more for his wounds and solitude than for his charm or poetry, he was a warrior at heart. Gorgo, however, had no desire for poetry. She sought both a partner and power. She became queen through her marriage to Leonidas. But Gorgo didn't slip into the background like other Greek queens did. She had no access to private women's quarters or endless candlelight weaving. As intellectual equals, Spartan queens were supposed to speak, counsel, and support their monarchs. Leonidas was also fully aware of his spouse. Gorgo was witty, devoted to Sparta, and completely unafraid to express her opinions, even to him. Respect for one another was the foundation of their collaboration. They probably didn't say much, but every word mattered in their people's renownedly concise speech patterns. Having grown up surrounded by politics, Gorgo probably gave Leonidas advice on internal Spartan rivalry, diplomatic difficulties, and Persian threats. Other Greek women were kept out of the spotlight, but Gorgo influenced Spartan policy both inside and beyond the palace. During the period leading up to the Persian invasion, she experienced one of her most iconic moments. With his little army of 300 Spartans, Leonidas prepared to march north as tensions with Xerxes increased. Gorgo, being an experienced political thinker, wasn't moved to tears or pleading before he went. She only gave him 6 spooky words instead: "Return on your shield or with it." It was more than a simple goodbye. It was a directive. Her spouse was reminded that it was better to die with honor than to live in shame, which was the ultimate Spartan command. He was to die standing if he failed to win. Leonidas did too. He and his 300 fell to the last man at Thermopylae, providing Greece valuable time to regroup. History would remember his passing, but Gorgo's words would reverberate more strongly. She didn't simply abandon her husband to perish, she contributed to the creation of the Thermopylae myth. Gorgo lived to preserve Leonidas's legacy and possibly to influence the empire his sacrifice attempted to save, but Leonidas died a hero. Many queens would have silently fallen into sorrow following Leonidas' death at Thermopylae, maybe vanishing from view, not Gorgo. In actuality, her impact only increased. She was no longer only a widow. She was suddenly the embodiment of Spartan tenacity. Gorgo became a living reminder of the reason they fought in the first place. Even as sculptures were erected in honor of the deceased, Sparta was exposed without Leonidas, politically as well as militarily. Tensions were high throughout the Greek world, alliances were shaky, and the war with Persia was still raging. Gorgo served as both a protector and a strategist in this mayhem. Several ancient authors, like as Herodotus, make it clear that Gorgo was consulted when issues of diplomatic or internal threat emerged, even if we lack precise accounts of her daily political maneuvers. She was trusted in addition to being included. According to one tale, a wooden tablet was used to convey a secret message to the Spartans. In order to conceal its contents, a warning about the impending invasion from Persia, the text had been scraped off and replaced with wax. The Spartan courtsmen were perplexed, but Gorgo calmly examined the odd tablet and told them to scrape the wax off. The bad news was in the original message beneath it. A diplomatic conundrum that might have cost Sparta everything had been resolved by Gorgo. Thousands of lives were probably saved by her insight. Gorgo was brilliant at more than just solving problems, though. She recognized the threat presented by Persian riches and the tenuous network of ties that bound the Greek city-states together. Gorgo's keen warning from boyhood still held true, even though Athens and other towns were notoriously susceptible to bribery. Gifts that smell of corruption should be avoided. She promoted a position of unwavering honor even in the face of political danger. The Spartans paid attention. Because Gorgo spoke with the accuracy of a soldier and the clarity of a strategist, rather than the softness that was typically expected of women in the ancient world. She was aware of the stakes, the essence of Sparta, not simply its territory. Gorgo was unfazed even in grief. Even though Leonidas lost the shield he brought to combat, Gorgo rose above it, the intellect that will sustain Sparta throughout its most gloomy moments. Understanding what it meant to be a woman in Sparta and how Gorgo elevated that already uncommon privilege to almost mythical status is essential to appreciating Gorgo's significance. In the ancient world, Spartan women were unique. Spartan women were taught to be physically powerful, intellectually astute, and socially assertive, in contrast to Athenian women who were restricted to the house, prohibited from participating in politics, and had little education. This was a survival tactic, not only cultural flair. Strong ladies, according to the Spartans, gave birth to strong boys. Thus, in their youth, girls trained, ran, and wrestled with guys. They were supposed to be in good health, self-assured, and not scared to tell it like it is. But Gorgo wasn't just one of many formidable Spartan ladies. She was the epitome of what it meant to be a Spartan woman. She was renowned for her sharp wit as well as her knowledge. In a well-known story, she was asked by a foreign woman, "Why are you Spartan women the only ones who rule your men?" Gorgo made no hesitation. "Because we are the only women who give birth to men," she retorted. Not only was that line witty, it was Spartan. It represented a society in which women's strength was valued as necessary rather than decorative. Motherhood was a political position in Gorgo's universe, not a passive one. Training a future warrior was the goal of raising a Spartan son. Raising her own son, Pleistarchus, who would succeed Leonidas as king, was also an act of dedication for Gorgo, not only to her family, but to the Spartan state as a whole. She probably handled his early education, instilled in him a love of duty rather than glory, and surrounded him with the ideals of honor, sacrifice, and discipline. Gorgo, however, never showed off her strength. She didn't have to. Because she used her voice infrequently and always accurately, it had weight. She was a force in real life, not just a queen in name. Gorgo's presence guaranteed that there was always a sharp-eyed strategist keeping watch from behind the throne, even if Sparta remained a dual monarchy ruled by men. She was in many respects Sparta's unwritten law, preserving its principles, challenging its leaders, and fortifying its backbone. Gorgo redefined more than only the role of queen. She changed the definition of Spartan identity. Politically as well as emotionally, Leonidas' death at Thermopylae was a turning point. He had turned into a martyr for Greece as a whole and a representation of defiance against Persian oppression. Sparta, however, could not afford to cry for very long. The entire Greek world's destiny would depend on the choices taken in the ensuing months while the war was still raging. Despite having no official position, Gorgo's influence persisted after her husband's death. It was necessary to establish a regency because her son, Pleistarchus, was still a minor. We may be certain that Gorgo played a part in directing his education and influencing the political choices taken in his name, even if historical documents do not name her as a formal regent. This was no time for mothers who were grieving. Cold computation was required at this time. Greece was sharply divided and the Persian menace remained present. Sparta desired a land battle while Athens desired a maritime battle. The unity was brittle. Gorgo most likely developed into a sort of unofficial advisor to the Council of Elders, or Spartan Gerousia, at this crucial time. She knew Greek pride as well as Persian guile. More significantly, she knew how to strike a balance between practical survival and Spartan honor. Sparta could not afford to appear weak or to act carelessly. Gorgo had learnt to balance the delicate balance of power after witnessing the destructive effects of unbridled ambition on her father, Cleomenes. She would have been there when Sparta contemplated its options, whether to defend the Peloponnesus and leave the rest of Greece to its own devices, whether to commit troops to the naval battle of Salamis, or whether to march north once more. Men who had recently lost their ruler in a flash of glory were making these difficult choices. Gorgo's logical, emotionally restrained and intensely patriotic presence might have been just what Sparta needed as an anchor. Her giving commands is not documented, but it wasn't necessary. Instead of giving orders, Spartan queens set an example. Even the fact that she survived and remained unflinching was a form of leadership. Gorgo had previously demonstrated her ability to carry the shield in a city that was enamored with honor. Now that Leonidas was gone, she infused every subsequent political decision with the memory of his sacrifice. Gorgo's position gradually changed from queen consort to queen mother, from political influencer to legacy steward, as the battle against Persia raged in the previous years. However, she was never a holdover from a bygone period. Gorgo continued to be a living example of Spartan principles, a force so powerful that she attracted attention even in the absence of a crown or a battlefield. Ultimately, Pleistarchus, her son, succeeded to the throne, but he was not the same as his father. Pleistarchus reigned in the long shadow of Leonidas, quiet, unknown, and mostly missing from military glory. Gorgo, the lady who had reared him, molded him, and made sure he knew what it meant to be descended from heroes, was standing behind him, still observing. However, Gorgo's uniqueness extended beyond her association with two monarchs. Her reputation, her intellect, And the fact that she is mentioned by name in several ancient sources, something quite unusual for women in classical history, were the factors. She is mentioned numerous times by Herodotus, the so-called father of history, who praises her cleverness and describes her capacity to solve mysteries and handle political dangers. Gorgo was unique in a world where women were frequently anonymous shadows, not as a tragic figure, a myth, or a lover, but as a force to be reckoned with. In many respects, she was the personification of what Sparta wished to think of itself, a culture in which even women were strong, intelligent, and prepared to fight for their country no matter what. Gorgo didn't have to use a spear in battle. She battled with words, advice, and unrelenting determination. She raised a monarch, kept a nation emotionally strong at its darkest moments, and made contributions in war councils and private discussions rather than on dusty battlefields. She is one of the few ancient Spartan ladies whose names have survived the ages. She was unforgettably memorable, not because she was a queen. In a time when women's accomplishments were readily forgotten, Gorgo's intelligence, wit, and political courage made an impression that was impossible to erase. Greatness was not inherited by her. She carved it in her own way, and for that Sparta, cruel and unyielding, adored her. Few things were valued in Sparta: strength, discipline, and silence. However, Gorgo was able to make her voice one of its most effective tools. Although she didn't talk much, what she said was remembered for centuries. She was a living example of how the correct words could reverberate more loudly than the clash of shields in a society where words were valued highly. Gorgo was an expert in Spartan wit, which is its own kind of verbal combat. She avoided flowery speech and metaphors. She cut straight to the core of pretense with the truth. When a foreign woman questioned, "Why are Spartan women the only ones who rule their men?" she gave one of her most famous answers. Gorgo's response was renowned. "Since we are the only females that are able to conceive males." The line was a declaration, not merely a remark. With stark, scathing pride, she summed up the entire Spartan worldview and female empowerment in 6 words, as only a Spartan could. She employed words like a general would employ strategies. She didn't falter or beg when she told her father about the bribery attempt when she was a child. She warned. Without hesitation, she provided the solution when Persian messages appeared concealed in wax. Gorgo didn't just talk, she used words to plan, and Sparta paid attention. Gorgo demonstrated that intelligence could also be a weapon in a civilization centered on the sword and governed by men. Her words have the cadence of authority and the clarity of someone who saw power as responsibility rather than as decoration. She was heard without having to scream. Every word she spoke was a dagger. And the fact that her statements were always grounded in reality is what made them so terrible. She didn't bluff. She was not flattering. As a queen, as a Spartan, as a woman who had witnessed wars break out and kingdoms fall, Gorgo was fully aware of what was expected of her. She confronted those demands head-on with thoughtful, memorable responses rather than emotional outbursts. Her weapon was her voice. Her strength was her intelligence. Gorgo was remembered for her words and for never saying anything she didn't mean, whereas many queens are remembered for their beauty or tears. That was the greatest respect somebody could receive in Sparta. Gorgo spent his last years in a city that never warmed up. Sparta resisted compromising its militaristic identity, in contrast to other Greek polis that developed into cultural hubs. It remained dangerously insular, prideful, and inflexible. And Gorgo, still erect amid its stone and bronze, saw firsthand the long-term effects of Leonidas's sacrifice on Greece as a whole, as well as Sparta. Yes, the Persians were ultimately driven back, but it cost them. With great prestige and a reputation as the guardian of Greek liberty, Sparta emerged from the Persian Wars, but rivalry accompanied honor. Driven by ambition and democracy, Athens gradually shifted from ally to enemy while increasing in riches and power. A new storm, the Peloponnesian War, was rising as tensions grew. The Spartans of the following generation, including Gorgo's own son, would be defined by this battle. Gorgo probably realized that Sparta's rigid principles, which had formerly been its greatest strength, were now turning into constraints if she could see the writing on the wall. Sparta was unaffected, but Athens innovated and adapted. Sparta was rigid due to the same military codes that once made it unbeatable. However, Gorgo, who was always practical, probably embraced this fact with the same steel-eyed clarity that she had displayed throughout her life. She had experienced a variety of conflicts, including diplomatic conflicts, alliance changes, and internal upheavals in addition to those involving spears and arrows. By this point, Gorgo was probably a living relic in the best sense of the word, a connection to Leonidas, a reminder of Sparta's former self, and a vision of what it could become again if it remained loyal to its essence, without going insane with pride. Although there are no surviving documents detailing her last days, there is no reason to suspect that she met them with anything less than composed determination. She had already accomplished more than the majority of men and women in her era. She had created a city that forbade its rulers from engaging in tenderness, battled without a blade, and ruled without a ruler. Gorgo grieved in private if she did. She didn't share her hopes for the future. Because in Sparta, heritage was valued more than feelings, and hers was already bound in blood and metal. Epic poetry and marble monuments were not necessary for Gorgo of Sparta to be remembered. She left her mark on something much more powerful, the collective memory of a city founded on rebellion, honor, and discipline. Gorgo's story is one of keen intelligence, political astuteness, and unwavering pride, in contrast to other queens whose tales were encased in tragedy or romance. As the daughter of King Cleomenes and the wife of King Leonidas, she stood at the crossroads of two of Sparta's greatest images, although neither ever dominated the other. She was a whole chapter in their stories, not just a footnote. Scholars and historians continue to be astounded by how often her name appears in Herodotus's works, not as a submissive royal, but as a pivotal character. Gorgo pierced the quiet like a spear through a shield in a world where women's names were seldom ever written down. The fact that she never held formal authority only serves to deepen her legacy. She did not sit on the throne or lead armies. She gave advice, she cautioned, she found the answer. A king was raised by her. Throughout it all, she personified the dreadful dignity of Sparta, a city that prioritized action over speech, silence over bragging, and death over shame. More than just a farewell, her most famous phrase is, "Come back with your shield, or on it." They are a condensed form of the Spartan code, a philosophy. The cold fire of their original context, a queen sending her husband to his death, remains intact despite their modern recreation, repainting, and even repurposing, not with tears, but with a charge to defend honor. Gorgo is one of the very few women from antiquity who are known today for their respect rather than their tragic, attractive, or scandalous qualities. In a culture already known for shattering expectations, she did just that. Her voice was so revered and her intelligence so evident that she became a part of Sparta's identity. Even though Gorgo lived more than 2,000 years ago, she is still relevant to every undervalued woman, every strategist who works in the background, and every voice that doesn't want to be heard. She serves as a constant reminder. Power doesn't necessarily wear a crown, and strength isn't always audible. The desert castles, the remnants of a vanished royal ambition, exist in the middle of Jordan's sun-bleached deserts, where the horizon appears to melt into the sky and quiet rules the sands. With their domed roofs, ornate arches, and hints of long faded murals. These eerie buildings, strewn throughout the barren terrain, almost look like hallucinations rising out of the vacuum. For ages they have baffled historians with their beauty, mystique, and seclusion. These fortresses, which were constructed in the 7th and 8th centuries during the Umayyad Caliphate, were not intended to fend off armies or protect trade routes. In the conventional sense, they were not strongholds. Rather, they served as hunting lodges, pleasure palaces, vacation homes, and opulent retreats for the Umayyad aristocracy. These areas served as retreats from the political life of Damascus, the Islamic world's capital at the time, for kings, princes, and other high-ranking officials, and they welcomed the roughness of the desert instead of running away from it. But why erect such opulent buildings in such harsh and isolated locations? The symbolism is part of the solution. The Umayyads were attempting to dominate nature as a whole, not just the land. They were sending a message when they built these castles in the desert. Their intellect, culture, and power would thrive even under the most severe circumstances. These structures served as symbols of Umayyad confidence, skill, and authority. A practical layer is also present. In order to function as way stations or administrative centers, several of the desert castles were constructed close to seasonal water sources or historic trade routes. The design and architecture, however, allude to something more profound despite their practicality. These were leisure and beauty spots. In the past, the walls glistened with murals that showed musicians, animals, and even Byzantine-style nudists, a startling development in early Islamic art. There were exquisite bathhouses, stargazing chambers, and intricately carved audience halls. Many of the desert castles that previously stood their ground are now in ruins, partly covered by the sand. Nevertheless, despite their deterioration, they depict a period when the desert served as a site of transformation rather than escape. The Umayyads left behind more than just building in these silent stones. They left a legacy of ambition, empire, and luxury born in an oasis. We must adopt the Umayyad perspective in order to comprehend Jordan's desert castles. Rising from the Arabian desert to dominate an empire spanning from Spain to Central Asia, this was the first great Islamic dynasty. Political power throbbed in Damascus, their capital. However, the Umayyads were still heavily influenced by their tribal nomadic heritage. It was impossible to avoid the desert. It was the tale of their birth, the furnace that had molded their forefathers. Thus, they introduced civilization into the wilderness rather than abandoning it. In a rapidly growing empire, the Umayyads were solidifying their hold on power. They had to project legitimacy as well as authority. Building opulent villas in remote locations with cosmopolitan flair and royal grandeur is the ideal method to impress both foreign envoys and indigenous tribes. These desert properties were used for elite meetings, hunting trips, and diplomacy, far away from Damascus's political intrigue and watchful eyes. However, these were not rudimentary hunting huts. They were elegant and frequently combined elements of Persian, Byzantine, and Roman architecture. The Umayyads weren't scared to blend styles because they had inherited the architectural lexicon of the countries they had conquered. Some of the castles had murals depicting legendary animals, fountains surrounded by Corinthian columns, and mosaics of grapevines. A strong message was conveyed by this eclectic fusion of East and West. The Umayyads were more than just warlords in the desert. A larger multi-civilizational legacy was passed down to them. The outer walls of buildings such as Qasr al-Mushatta still have elaborate stonework with geometric and floral patterns that evoke a combination of Greco-Roman flamboyance and Islamic moderation. Frescoes at Qusayr Amra feature musicians, bathing scenes, and even a depiction of the 6 kings, which shows Byzantine, Persian, and Ethiopian monarchs honoring the Umayyads. Painted in plaster and pigment, it was visual propaganda, comfort was not the only consideration in these castles. They have to do with appearance. The Umayyads realized that a stage was necessary for authority. Far from the bustle of the capital, they performed dominance, luxury, and cultural refinement in these desert theatres. They constructed a vision of empire that was both archaic and completely novel on the blank canvas of the desert. Of all the desert castles, Qusayr Amra is the one that captures the imagination the most. From the outside, it appears to be a simple squat structure made of dusty stone, half buried in the great silence of the Jordanian desert. However, you enter another universe as you step inside. Images, colors that resist the harshness of the outside world, and frescoes that whisper secrets from 13 centuries ago abound on the walls. It is believed that Caliph al-Walid Fais, or one of his princes, commissioned Qusayr Amra to be built in the early 8th century. It was half spa, part political retreat, part cultural statement, and part pleasure palace and bathhouse. The structure is an Umayyad observatory concealed in the desert, featuring a domed audience hall, many bathing rooms, and a vaulted ceiling painted with constellations. However, what really sets Qusayr Amra apart are the frescoes. They portray a world completely different from what is currently believed about early Islamic art, and they cover almost every surface. Images of hunting settings, wine drinking, dancing women, and even Greek legendary characters like Hercules are depicted. One room's ceiling features personifications of the planets and the zodiac. The Six Kings fresco, a potent propaganda piece that depicts rulers from far-off places ostentatiously submitting to the Umayyads, is shown on another wall. It serves to further the notion that the desert was also under their control. For many years, this audacious use of figural art has generated controversy. Anachronism and the avoidance of human and animal figures are frequently linked to Islamic art. Qusayr Amra, however, demonstrates that the early Islamic world was much more intricate. The Umayyads were not only constructing places of worship, they were constructing secular ones in which power, astronomy, and wealth might coexist in a visual feast. Time, however, has taken its toll. Centuries of heat and wind have caused many frescoes to fade and lose their color. Their eerie beauty has been preserved, however, thanks to repair efforts. As a UNESCO World Heritage Site today, Qusayr Amra offers a unique window into the personal, sensual, and politically charged ideal of Umayyad authority. Qusayr Amra continues to mutter about courtly tunes, hot baths, and starry ceilings in the midst of a desolate, parched plain. It is more than just a structure. It is a painting of a desert fantasy that defies time. East of Amman, Qasr al-Quran, a huge symmetrical box of limestone and accuracy, rises like a mirage from the arid plains. It appears to be a military fortress from a distance, no obvious entry from three sides, thick walls and arrow loop-like small openings. Here's the twist, though. The Qasr al-Quran is not a stronghold, not in the conventional sense anyway. Its mysterious design and unclear purpose are its secrets, not combat. One of the best preserved Umayyad castles, this desert building dates to the early 8th century, but there is still disagreement among academics on what it was. It looks like a fortress, yet it has no actual defenses, no battlements, no water supply, and no sign of a garrison in place. Although light might have entered through the little openings, assailants would not have been deterred. So why the masquerade with the armor? It is commonly believed that Qasr al-Quran functioned as a caravanserai, a wayside rest stop for diplomats, traders, and travelers traversing the desert. It could easily house visitors, servants, and animals in its roughly 60 rooms, which are spread on 2 stories around a central courtyard. It might have served as a gathering place for tribal chiefs and a venue for the Umayyad government to exert authority over the Bedouin tribes that ruled the desert's interior. The construction is more subtly sophisticated within. There are ornamental recesses, vaulted ceilings, and even remnants of plastering. The rooms on the second level, which are large enough to impress but private enough to conduct business, may have been utilized for meetings or negotiations. Its widespread use is indicated by some of the graffiti engraved into the walls, which allude to literate visitors from various geographical areas. It seems as though Qasr al-Kharana is a puzzle designed to resemble a fortress, but function more like a salon. Its ambiguity itself might have been deliberate. Looks counted in an era of widening boundaries and political unpredictability. The building simultaneously conveyed a sense of strength, solidity, and friendliness. Visitors can now stroll through its reverberating hallways, look out through the small windows, and speculate about the agreements, disputes, and coalitions that previously took place there. It is more of a diplomatic chessboard than a battlefield, a castle of shadows and nuance. In the desolate Jordanian desert, Qasr al-Kharana serves as a platform for spectacle and politics, rather than as a monument to battle. Even in its broken state, Qasr al-Mashata shines with ambition despite its current ruin. Despite never having been built, this Umayyad palace just south of Amman nevertheless has the skeletal remains of an imperial dream. Qasr al-Mashata is arguably the most ornate of all the desert castles, and its surviving facade is among the best examples of early Islamic stonework that can be found. The remarkable stone relief that formerly decorated its southern facade is what first draws the attention of tourists and historians. The wall is a beautiful blend of Byzantine, Sasanian, and early Islamic artistic traditions, featuring geometric patterns, floral motifs, and stylized creatures. Powerful, cultured, and embracing of the cultures it had subjugated or acquired, it is a visual declaration of the Umayyad identity. The irony is that a large portion of the facade is no longer in Jordan. A portion of it was given to the German Kaiser by the Ottoman Sultan at the beginning of the 20th century. The greatest surviving piece is now housed in Berlin's Pergamon Museum, a piece of desert splendor transplanted within European marble halls. However, the ruins at Mashata are still impressive even without it. The meticulously laid foundations, the contours of a large courtyard, and glimpses of the ornate entry hall are still visible. What was the intended purpose of Qasr al-Mashata then? According to the majority of academics, it was designed as a winter palace that made a royal statement rather than merely serving as a retreat. Its size and craftsmanship imply that it was intended to wow guests, possibly foreign dignitaries or tribal allies. The palace would have been a self-contained haven of power in the desert, complete with courtyards, private rooms, audience halls, and even a mosque. But suddenly there was a sudden halt to construction. Some claim that it was abandoned as a result of the passing of Caliph al-Walid II, who ordered it. Others cite changing political objectives or structural problems. For whatever reason, Mashata's vision was locked in mid-dream, leaving it incomplete. Nevertheless, the ruin is still revered. Qasr al-Mashata presents a coherent narrative despite its incompleteness. The Umayyads were more than just kings and warriors. They were visionaries, cultural constructors, and designers who dared to infuse elegance into the most bleak environments. Despite its silence, Mashata's carved stones continue to express an imperial language that is audacious, complex, and timeless. Extensive bathhouses in the middle of the desert may initially seem odd. However, hammams served as more than just restrooms for the Umayyads. Ritual, leisure, diplomacy, and even heavenly reflection took place there. These bath facilities, which are dispersed throughout Jordan's desert castles, are evidence of how the Umayyads introduced comfort and civilization to one of the harshest settings on earth. For instance, Qusayr Amra. The entire Roman-style bath system, apoditarium, changing room, tepidarium, warm room, caldarium, hot steam room, and furnace system underground to heat it all, akin to the ancient Roman thermae, are located behind its painted walls. Although the technology was not new, the intention was new to Islam. The knowledge of their acquired lands had been assimilated by the Umayyad, who modified it to suit their own requirements. Having a working bathhouse was an indication of significant wealth and power in a culture where water was valuable. It proved that the caliphate could not only endure nature but also control it. Bathing was social as well as hygienic. Here, kings and courtiers might unwind, entertain tribal chiefs, or have private conversations about important issues. It was formality encased in familiarity. Then there is the artistic side. Frescoes that defy assumptions, zodiac signs, planetary figures, bathing women, musicians, and hunting scenes can be found inside the steam-filled walls of these hammams. In many bathhouses, particularly Qusair Amra, where constellations are painstakingly painted on the dome, the ceilings even resemble old-fashioned planetariums. Bathing seems to have been transformed into a cosmic experience that connects the spiritual immensity of the heavens with the physical purification of the body. This embracing of luxury was planned. It was not decadence. The Puritans were not the Umayyads. They thought that showing off their sophistication would validate their authority. Furthermore, a hot bath was just as much a political statement as a military march in the desert, where luxury was limited. Nestled among desolate palaces, these hammams provided not only water, but also culture, locations where steam replaced the sand and where painted ceilings below reflected the stars above. They serve as a reminder that the Umayyads lived elegantly and purposefully even while they were exiled from the city. The fact that many of Jordan's desert castles appear to have been built for the stars as much as for comfort or politics is among their most captivating and underappreciated features. The night sky was both a map and a mystery in the days before telescopes and smartphones. As the heirs of Persian cosmology and Greco-Roman science, the Umayyads regarded the stars with both intellectual interest and spiritual devotion, and they incorporated that attraction into their desert resort's architectural design. For instance, the bathhouse dome in Qusair Amra is painted with an astrological sky. In an intricate fusion of art and science, the ceiling is encircled with stars, zodiac signs, and cosmic symbols. Decoration for decoration's sake is not what this is. It displays a thorough comprehension of astronomy, probably passed down from the Byzantine and Persian scribes and intellectuals. Not all Umayyads were warriors. As cultural sponges, they soaked in everything that the ancient world had to offer. It's possible that these cosmic themes had more than one level of significance. On the one hand, they demonstrated the caliphate's complexity and wisdom. Conversely, they reflected a greater spiritual connection to the universe, the idea that the stars reflected power on earth. It was not merely good politics to align one's reign with the order of the heavens. It was symbolic of God. The night sky would have been overwhelming in the desert silence, away from the city lights. There are thousands of stars shining on black velvet. The wide courtyards and domed apartments of the desert castles made them perfect for observation. These locations were ideal for seeing the sky, whether for calendar calculations, desert navigation, or more occult activities. Silence, solitude, and awe of the heavens must have produced an atmosphere that was as spiritual as it was scientific. It is important to keep in mind that early Islam and science did not conflict. Indeed, the foundation for the later Islamic golden age of astronomy was laid during the Umayyad period. Built in the middle of nowhere, these castles were part of that intellectual legacy and served as locations to think about the sky as well as to rule and bathe. The Umayyads, desert kings with their eyes on the stars, inscribed their position between earth and sky in stone and painting. The Jordanian desert castle's extreme isolation is one of the most persistent mysteries surrounding them. Why would the Umayyads construct opulent mansions, elaborately furnished baths, and observatories adorned with stars so far from any significant city or community? Not only does geography hold the answer, but psychology, politics, and performance do as well. Let's start with the practical. The earliest Umayyads continued to be influenced by their tribal, nomadic heritage. The desert was not a barrier to them, it was home. The vast terrain provided freedom, seclusion, and comfort. By constructing in the desert, the caliphs and their princes were able to re-establish a connection with their heritage and escape the never-ending stress of court life in Damascus. Outposts, these weren't. They served as havens. However, there was another more profound reason for the seclusion: symbolic dominance. It was a deliberate act of power to build colossal structures in the middle of parched desolation. It proved that the caliph's will could tame and alter even the most desolate and hostile terrain. These fortresses demonstrated that Umayyad power reached into the emptiness of nature, beyond towns and farmland. Additionally, remote positioning guaranteed exclusivity and secrecy. Far from the gossip and rivalries of city politics, these castles served as venues for delicate talks and the wooing of tribe leaders with presence and extravagance. The isolation allowed for exploration, indulgence, and diplomacy. Whether that meant partaking in exotic traditions or appreciating figural art that was prohibited in more rigid religious contexts. Furthermore, the locations were frequently more strategically important than they first seemed. Some castles were situated close to important water sources or seasonal trading routes. Others served as governmental checkpoints, monitoring Bedouin tribes or providing resting places for caravans and couriers. On a map, their sites might have appeared far away, but in the early Islamic Empire's political landscape, they were strategically important chess pieces. And lastly, the visual appeal. The desert's immense nothingness provided a background that accentuated the building's grandeur. These buildings seemed like miracles because of the contrast between the bare earth and the elaborate brickwork. Oasis of culture and grace created by humans that proudly defy the elements. Their distance was the point, not a weakness. Every desert castle was a subdued roar, proclaiming that beauty, authority, and sophistication could flourish where nothing else dared. Even while they may no longer reverberate with the footsteps of diplomats, caliphs, or stargazers, Jordan's desert castles persist, silent remnants of a civilization that dared to leave its splendor in void. And they have a new function now. Scholars, tourists, and dreamers are drawn to these windows into a world that has vanished, wandering through their sand-swept halls in pursuit of lost tales. These locations have been welcomed by contemporary Jordan as both historical landmarks and representations of cultural tenacity. With Qusayr Amra proudly displaying its UNESCO World Heritage Site designation, castles like as Qusayr Amra, Qasr al-Qarana, and Qasr al-Mushatta are now protected heritage monuments. Restoration efforts have stabilized frescoes, removed debris, and allowed the public to explore these remains by carefully striking a balance between authenticity and preservation. Nevertheless, nature and time continue to be steadfast enemies. The fragile artwork and structures are still in danger from the severe desert climate, strong sun, dry winds, and sand erosion. Protecting locations that were never intended to endure more than a millennium, let alone dealing with contemporary tourism and climate change, is a difficult problem for conservationists. However, the endeavor continues because of the belief that these ruins contain spiritual and cultural wisdom in addition to artistic and architectural worth. These castles evoke awe and curiosity in contemporary tourists. How could there be such beauty in such solitude? What does it reveal about art, survival, and the nature of power? One is struck by the tenacity of memory rather than degradation when they stroll through the painted chambers of Qusayr Amra or look through the little windows of Qasr al-Karana. Furthermore, the desert castles serve as a reminder that the early Islamic culture was far more open, inventive, and diversified than is sometimes depicted. These constructions cast doubt on preconceived notions about Islamic art, desert wealth, and the division of East and West. They show a dynasty that was both tradition-based and eager for new ideas. Even though the castles are now once more isolated, encircled by stone and quiet, they remain remembered. They talk of a civilization that viewed the desert as a stage rather than a void, but they do it in whispers rather than yells. And in spite of everything, their tale continues to reverberate through the sands and into the contemporary world. Imagine living in a world without writing, numbers, or even the idea of hours or months. Our Paleolithic forebears lived in this world. Even so, time passed and people became aware. Early humans kept track of time by observing nature before there were calendars, timekeeping tools, or even words to explain it. Their only clock was the Earth's rhythm, light, seasons, and sky. The day itself was the most visible cycle. Time was separated into light and dark by sunrise and sunset. Beyond that, however, people soon discovered how to observe the moon. Its phases were dramatic and constant, a brilliant disk expanding, contracting, and vanishing with uncanny regularity. By dividing existence into recurring units that would eventually give rise to the concept of months, the moon became the first timekeeper. Actually, the word month itself is derived from the word moon. A complete moon cycle, which lasted roughly 29.5 days, signified much more to early humans than just a lovely night sky. It served as a manual for hunting, planting, gathering, and getting ready for the next step. However, the moon wasn't by itself. The length of the shadows varied throughout the year. Certain stars only emerged during particular seasons, and the sun's location at sunrise changed along the horizon. Communities started to recognize these trends across many generations, and more crucially, to transmit them. This was more than merely observable knowledge, it was holy. Knowing time meant knowing the earth, the gods, and life itself. During solstices, ancient people aligned stones with the sun's rising point, painted symbols on cave walls, and etched grooves into bones. These were not crude scrawls. They were the first attempts to indicate the passing of time. The earliest calendars that have been discovered date back 30,000 years. Antler bones with engraved tally marks may have been used to track menstrual or lunar cycles, which are closely related to fertility and survival. Early humans lived in harmony with the signals of nature as they lacked clocks. Time wasn't a concept, it was the earth's breath. It provided guidance on when to hunt, when to hide, when to move, and when to hold out hope. Time has meaning before it had numbers. Prior to having names, it had stories that were inscribed in stone, illuminated by fire, and directed by the sky above. The moon served as more than just a source of illumination for prehistoric people. The sky was inscribed with a clock, waxing crescent to full moon, then waning to darkness before the cycle again. Its phases were dependable and captivating. The first and most widely recognized natural cycle was this about 29.5-day regularity. Moons were being counted by hunter-gatherers throughout continents long before civilizations emerged. Moons, not years or weeks. The earliest actual calendars were based on these lunar phases. We know this because engraved bones and stones with carved patterns in recurring sequences have been discovered by archaeologists. These items most likely count the number of days between each visible moon phase. Writing and even agriculture were predated by some of these artifacts, which date back more than 30,000 years. Many academics think that a lunar calendar, possibly one that was used to track hunting or reproduction seasons, is represented by a set of notches found on one such find, the Ashango bone from Central Africa. Why the moon? Since it was the simplest method of observing time change. The moon was visible, changing every few days and providing a sense of advancement, while solar changes were gradual and stars required in-depth understanding. This was dependable and useful for early humans, particularly those who lived on the move. A full moon cycle lasted 1 month, and 12 of those nearly, but not quite, matched a full solar year. Later issues would arise from this discrepancy, particularly for agricultural communities that required more precise planting times. Many societies formalized these lunar calendars as civilizations emerged. Lunar timekeeping was employed by the Hebrews, Babylonians, Egyptians, Chinese, and Maya. Some have stayed purely lunar to this day, such as the Islamic calendar. To bring the moon's cycle into line with the solar year, some started making adjustments by adding leap days or months. However the moon was in charge during these early phases, the calendar was a holy map, not merely a tool. Gods, goddesses, or other celestial beings that guarded the populace were frequently personified as the moon. Its cycles were connected to stories, festivals, and rituals. Early humans were giving time meaning by tracking the moon, not merely measuring it. We learned to count from the moon. And via counting, we started to see time as something that could be named, held, and transmitted rather than as an endless blur. The moon was no longer sufficient when human cultures developed from wandering bands to permanent agricultural settlements. It was not enough to know when a month was over to be a farmer. It required exact knowledge of the seasons, when to plant, when to harvest, and when to expect rain or frost. Early humans looked to the sun for that. The sun moved over the horizon during the course of a year, although its movements were less noticeable than those of the moon. However, those who watched with patience started to see a trend. The location of the sun's daily rise and set was not constant. The sun reached significant turning points at specific periods of the year, which we now refer to as the solstices and equinoxes. By designating the longest and shortest days, as well as the moments when day and night were perfectly balanced, these turned into cosmic anchors. Solar calendars were first constructed by ancient people using stone rather than ink. England's Stonehenge is the most well-known example. Its precise function is still up for question, although it is undeniably in line with the summer and winter solstices. On some days, certain stones are precisely aligned with the sun's rise or set. This was amazing accuracy in a world without clocks. Similar alignments can be found all over the world, including at the temples of Machu Picchu, the Chaco Canyon in North America, and the Nabta Playa stone circle in the desert of Egypt. These weren't arbitrary, they were constructed by sky observers who linked religious rites and agricultural cycles with celestial phenomena. The sun was more than just a gigantic lamp to these ancient societies. It was divine. Numerous cultures revered solar deities, such as Surya in India, Ra in Egypt, and Inti in the Andes. As a sign of continuity and regeneration, the sun's reappearance following the longest night was frequently reason for celebration. These celebrations subsequently served as the foundation of early religious calendars, since they were in line with solar phenomena. It took time, architecture, and spiritual vision to track the sun. It required mapping the sky, documenting the horizon, noting time permanently, and observing the entire solar year, rather than simply 1 month at a time. The sun provided structure where the moon provided mobility. Humans started binding the heavens to the earth with stones and shadows. Time was no longer merely a cycle as a result. With the earth engraved into it, the stars aligned, and the sacred wrapped around it, it became a calendar. Early societies used timekeeping for purposes other than agriculture and the seasons. It was an act of spirituality. Time itself was revered, a holy cadence that permeated everyday existence from the sky. Every moment has purpose, every season had cosmic significance. Calendars were more than just graphs, they served as ceremonial tools created to harmonize human conduct with divine will. Priests in ancient Mesopotamia ascended ziggurats to study the stars and planets in addition to getting closer to the sky. These were not strictly scientific observations. They were devotional deeds. The Babylonians were remarkably accurate in their division of time. We still measure minutes and degrees using a base 60 number system, a 7-day week, and a 360-day year. But efficiency wasn't the point here. It had to do with order. They were reflecting the universe's divine structure by measuring time. The Egyptians went one step further. They had one of the most sophisticated calendars in antiquity, and it was tightly linked to the rising of Sirius, the brightest star in the sky, and the Nile. Sirius's reappearance at dawn signified the Nile's flooding, which is a life-giving event. The Egyptian New Year, a festival associated with fertility, rebirth, and divine favor, began at that moment in time. The Maya created one of the most complex calendar systems ever created across the seas, fusing planetary motions, solar years, lunar cycles, and holy numerals into a sequence of time counts that interlocked. The Harb calendar followed the 365-day solar year, but their Tzolk'in calendar followed a 260-day spiritual cycle. The Maya did not have linear time. It was divine, cyclical, and closely related to ritual and prophecy. There was a spirit in every moment. Each date had a fate. Celestial rhythms were used to time festivals, sacrifices, coronations, and even warfare. Not only were kings crowned when it was politically advantageous, but also when the timing was right. Ignoring the calendar was a recipe for trouble in the universe as well as the fields. Timekeeping in this world meant controlling meaning itself, not individuals. Ancient civilizations were ruled by sacred time, and the sun, moon, and stars helped the calendar evolve from a mere log of days to a conduit between the divine and the mortal. The need to manage time beyond months and seasons increased with the complexity of civilizations. Slowly, the idea of a year, a complete rotation of the Earth around the sun, began to take shape. It was difficult to comprehend, however, that a year consisted of around 365.225 days. Centuries of observation, adjustment, and yes, annoyance were required. The first years of formalization were frequently flawed. Although helpful, lunar calendars caused issues. The total of the 12 lunar months was only approximately 354 days, which is almost 11 days less than the solar year. This gap eventually led to mayhem. Spring ceremonies were placed in the middle of winter, and harvest feasts started to stray into the incorrect season. Civilizations had to decide whether to reverse the drift or remain faithful to the moon. The latter was chosen by many. To bring their lunar calendar into line with the seasons, the Babylonians introduced an intercalary month every few years. But the Egyptians made a more daring move. They switched to a solar calendar and completely abandoned the moon. 365 days are split up into 12 months, each lasting 30 days, with an additional 5 days at the end. For its time, this was both novel and remarkably precise. However, the Egyptian year was still a quarter of a day behind the actual solar year. This resulted in a discernible drift over ages. Festivals for the new year came later and later. Then came the Romans, who tried to improve the timekeeping that they had received from the Greeks and Egyptians. Their early Roman calendar was a bewildering jumble of political scheming and lunar months. Massive irregularities resulted from the addition or removal of months in response to political demands. Things didn't alter until 45 BCE, when Julius Caesar instituted the Julian calendar. In order to account for that annoying extra quarter day, Caesar instituted a 365-day year with a leap day every 4 years, as suggested by the Alexandrian astronomer Sosigenes. It was the first completely solar calendar to be widely used throughout an empire, and it was a huge fix. The concept of a year was used for more than just farming. It was also used for governance, taxes, religious observances, and military battles. Empires were now molded by the calendar. The year's greatest invention was humanity's decision to bring order to the whirling sky and defeat chaos. After naming the year, we started measuring everything in it, which gave civilization its pulse and history its beat. The next task for humanity was to divide the year into manageable, significant portions when it had been established. Months and weeks were created as a result, giving our timekeeping a sense of rhythm and transforming everyday existence into something dependable and revered. The moon is the primary source of months. The 29.5-day period between full moons served as the original basis for the calendars of the majority of ancient societies. A lunar year was made up of 12 of these, or about 354 days. However, because this conflicted with the 365-day solar year, societies like the Egyptians and subsequently the Romans started to alter the system by adding leap months, changing the number of days, or even moving to solar-based months. The names and shapes of the modern months are mostly the result of Roman influence. Beginning in March, their early calendar featured months named after gods, such as Martius for Mars, September for Seven, and subsequently emperors, such as Julius Caesar for July and Augustus for Augustus. Caesar's Julian calendar, among other political reforms, helped standardize the 12-month solar calendar, which included 28 31-day months. However, what about the week, that odd unit of 7 days that doesn't neatly separate a year or a month? Its beginnings are not so much astronomical as magical. The 7 visible celestial bodies, the Sun, Moon, Mars, Mercury, Jupiter, Venus, and Saturn, were the source of the number 7, which the Babylonians found fascinating. They gave a planet to each day, a custom that is still used in many languages today and impacted later Greek and Roman naming schemes. The 7-day week was established by Jewish religious tradition. According to Genesis, God rested on the 7th day after creating the world in 6. Eventually, this holy building spread throughout the Western world after being embraced and continued in Christianity and Islam. The 7-day week was established by the time the Romans adopted it in the 1st century CE, not because it made sense, but because it had significance. The week has no natural basis in contrast to months and years. It is a human-made rhythm that is imposed on time. Nevertheless, it persists, influencing social life, religious observance, and work schedules throughout eras and civilizations. Humans provided time rhythm by dividing it into months and weeks, and rhythm gave us routine, ritual, and rest. Calendars changed from being survival tools to being tools of power as civilizations developed. The person in charge of the calendar ruled not only the seasons but also society as a whole. The date influenced royal decrees, taxes, harvests, festivities, and even military campaigns. Calendars evolved into cultural weapons, political instruments, and religious declarations that were used to strengthen authority, unite empires, and define identities. Julius Caesar made a statement in ancient Rome when he reorganized the disorganized Roman calendar. When the Julian calendar was adopted in 45 BCE, chaos was subdued by order. It made it possible for the Roman Empire to coordinate governance over a wide range of lands from Egypt to Britain. Additionally, the calendar itself became a tribute to Caesar's legacy when July was renamed in his honor. Because no emperor wanted his month to be shorter than his predecessors, Augustus Caesar later adopted this practice, renaming August after himself and extending its duration to match July. Even time had to be flattering to power in Rome. Imperial dynasties in China, meantime, produced calendars according to the directives of the current emperor. The Chinese calendar was a highly developed lunisolar system that had symbolic as well as utilitarian purposes. The notion that a new emperor had received the mandate of heaven was reinforced by the fact that a new calendar cycle frequently started when he came to power. The emperor's position within cosmic harmony was represented in the calendar. The Hijra, or Prophet Muhammad's journey from Mecca to Medina, was a political and spiritual event that marked the beginning of the Islamic calendar, which was instituted under the reign of Caliph Umar in the 7th century CE. It stayed entirely lunar, in contrast to solar calendars, causing religious holidays to change with the seasons. However, such flexibility turned into a common thread that bound Muslims in all climates and geographical locations to the same spiritual calendar. Calendars even became arenas of power struggle in medieval Europe. To facilitate conversion, the Church synchronized Catholic holidays and saints' days with pre-existing pagan cycles. Even time was baptized. The calendar instructed people on how to act, in addition to telling them what day it was. Calendars weren't neutral. They were created by the ruling class and indicated when history started, when armies marched, when debts were due, and when gods were worshipped. From kings to priests, astronomers to emperors, the authority to mark time evolved into a kind of domination. Because to make your story the beat of everyone else's life was to mold the calendar, which in turn shaped reality itself. Time itself had become out of sync by the 16th century. Once a marvel of Roman engineering, the Julian calendar had gradually become less accurate. A tiny inaccuracy that accumulated over millennia was its miscalculation of the solar year, which was around 11 minutes every year. The spring equinox, which used to occur around March 21st, has retreated to March 10th by the 1500s. This was a theological issue for a church that celebrated Easter based on specific dates. The Gregorian calendar, the most important calendar reform in history, was introduced in 1582 by Pope Gregory III. Under the direction of Jesuit mathematicians and astronomers, the Pope came up with a straightforward yet revolutionary answer. 10 days were removed from the calendar to bring it into line with the solar year. October 15th, 1582, came right after October 4th. The very course of time was altered. However, the change didn't end there. The leap year rule was also updated by Gregory's group. Every 4 years, the Julian calendar added a leap day, but that was too liberal. The leap year was maintained every 4 years under the new rule, unless the year was again divisible by 400 or by 100. Thus, whereas 1700, 1800 and 1900 were not leap years, 1600 was. By doing this, the calendar's precision was brought within 26 seconds of the solar cycle annually, correcting the long-term drift. Adoption, however, was neither general nor quick. The Gregorian calendar was distrusted by Protestant and Orthodox countries who saw it as a Catholic power struggle. It wasn't adopted in England until 1752, by which time the inaccuracy had increased to 11 days. Only after the Bolshevik Revolution in 1918 did Russia make the change. The outcome? Dates could vary significantly between nations over centuries. Imagine 2 people in neighboring countries celebrating New Year's 2 weeks apart. The Gregorian calendar gradually overcame opposition to become the universal standard, not due to religious beliefs, but rather to practical considerations. A common system of time was required as global trade, international diplomacy, science, and navigation expanded. The Gregorian calendar was just too accurate and practical to be disregarded. This wasn't only a fix. The way that people perceived time was revolutionized. Modern timekeeping began when the world's days were recalculated with a stroke of a papal pen. The Gregorian reform ultimately accomplished more than just resolving Easter. Time became a dance between heaven and earth once more, as it brought the human clock into line with the celestial one. The calendar seems commonplace these days, plastered on office walls, kitchen magnets, and smartphones. Behind its numbers and grids, however, is a tradition that has been developed over thousands of years, a journey from stargazing to satellite synchronization, from mechanical accuracy to spiritual ceremony. Once the purview of astronomers and monks, timekeeping is today a worldwide system that is standardized, controlled, and constantly ticking. Nowadays, practically everyone uses the Gregorian calendar. International law, shipping timetables, space missions, and the Olympic Games are all governed by it. Although this calendar predominates, there are still others that recite old rhythms. Millions of Muslims still base their religious lives on the Islamic Hijri calendar. Jewish holidays are governed by the Hebrew calendar. Lunar New Year celebrations are shaped by the Chinese lunar calendar. The Gregorian calendar and regional calendars coexist in India. Diversity was not abandoned by humanity. It merely covered old roots with layers of usefulness. Atomic time, the most accurate timekeeping system yet developed, comes next. International Atomic Time, or TAI, is based on the vibrations of cesium atoms and is so accurate that it only changes by 1 second every hundreds of millions of years. Coordinated Universal Time, UTC, the Universal Time Standard that underpins everything from airline timetables to Internet protocols, is derived from this. To compensate for Earth's rather erratic rotation, leap seconds are occasionally added to UTC. This serves as a reminder that even in the era of perfection, the planet itself is not entirely dependable. We yet continue to live in accordance with distinctly human rhythms in spite of all this accuracy. We commemorate birthdays. We eagerly await the weekend. In the same way that ancient people previously waited for the sun to rise again, we count down to midnight on New Year's Eve with hopeful hearts. In its current form, the calendar serves as both a tool and a custom. Yes, it prevents planes from crashing, but it also serves as a reminder of when to assemble, when to take a break, and when to recall. Its icy efficiency belies the same need to comprehend our place in time that motivated our ancestors to align stones with the sky and carve grooves into bones. We measure ourselves, the past, the present, and our hopes for the future when we measure time.